And of course, we have Sarah Sanders. We are graced with Sarah's presence tonight. I have to say, I'm a little starstruck. I love you as Aunt Lydia on The Handmaid's Tale. Mike Pence, if you haven't seen it, you would love it. Every time Sarah steps up to the podium, I get excited because I'm not really sure what we're going to get. You know, a press briefing, a bunch of lies, or divided into softball teams. It's shirts and skins, and this time don't be such a little bitch, Jim Acosta. I actually really like Sarah. I think she's very resourceful. Like, she burns facts, and then she uses that ash to create a perfect smoky eye. Like, maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's lies. It's probably lies. And I'm never really sure what to call Sarah Huckabee Sanders. You know, is it Sarah Sanders? Is it Sarah Huckabee Sanders? Is it Cousin Huckabee? Is it Auntie Huckabee Sanders? Like, what's Uncle Tom but for white women who disappoint other white women? Oh, I know, Aunt Coulter. We've got our friends at CNN here. Welcome, guys. It's great to have you. You guys love breaking news, and you did it. You broke it. Good work.
You're listening to TMI for the week of May 7th, 2018.
On this week's show, Dave speaks to retired businessman Chris Hacker. Chris recently moved to Thailand to pursue his interest in Buddhism. We talked about growing up Christian, discovering Buddhism, American politics, and international tensions between America, China, and Russia.
You worked in business. You essentially were selling advertisement to the newsprint media, magazines, and news outlets.
Yeah, that's a lot of what I did.
You retired, used a lot of market research in what you did, so it's a very dry and numbersy way to make a living. You retired, you moved to Thailand.
Yeah.
Now, you did that to pursue Buddhism.
Not Buddhism per se, meditation in a Buddhist style, but it's not a part of the Buddhist religion. It's separate from the religion. I'm not a Buddhist.
So at what point in your sort of Canadian developed world existence, that's a bad way of putting it, we'll edit that out.
I understand it, though. That's perfect.
But you're living this North American life. At what point did you get interested in meditation and Buddhism?
Well, maybe the body preconditions this. When I was, let's say, 7 or 9 or 11 years old, my mother would walk past the bedroom and see me sitting there reading, and I'd be sitting in a lotus position while I was reading the book. She used to call me Buddha. Maybe that's what got me started. But what I remember is when I was about 18 or 19, seeing a German word, Istigkeit, which meant isness or being. And I became curious as to what being might be. I had no idea, none. Yeah, so the path of anybody who follows the teachings of Buddha is to become more aware of this, of the nature of being.
So it's not like a born-again moment. This is something that takes time. Comes in steps.
Is it like born again or the relationship with born again? I imagine they're one and the same thing. I think what happens, however, in the case of many Christians, is their minds are so conditioned by the myths and stories of their religion that this clouds their awakening. What a Buddhist would seek, and certainly what the Buddha himself sought, was the purity of awakening without it being preconditioned and dependent on something else. For a Christian, that born-again element is dependent upon their God and the son of their God, who was impregnated by the Holy Ghost, according to the story. But you're familiar with that, right, Dave?
The traditional Christian story, yes. It's hard to avoid that.
It is, isn't it? And that's certainly the legacy of my 20 Church of England years.
Well, I have a weird upbringing. My mother, she was never religious at all. In fact, she's probably an atheist. But I was forced to go to a whole series of churches. Every time we moved, I was sent to another church. And the purpose of that was to engage me in the community and have me meet more local kids who live right, in that same area around the church and be educated. I don't know that she was trying to. Some people think that you can't predict who will want religion later in their life, and if you don't expose kids to it, they don't have that option.
Well, I'm very much I have a different perspective on that.
Okay.
My daughter was quite willfully brought up without benefit of the church. I told the family, I didn't tell them as an instruction, although certainly there was some intent behind it, that my kid wasn't going to be going to church services and she wasn't a part of the Christian faith, and that it would none of those things except for births, marriages, would she show up in church. And I think pretty much they kept to it. I bet her grand snuck her in a couple of times, but other than that, she was unsullied. And that seems to me the perfect way, because the child is born atheist, obviously. They can't possibly have any beliefs. Why shake that? Why put bias on it? Why spin it this way or that way, depending on which Christian sect or which Islamic sect you happen to... It seems wrong to me. It seems morally unjustifiable. If I thought you could put a prison sentence on it, I would. That's how I feel. I mean, I'm exaggerating, because I don't think you should put people in jail for that. But there should be some way to protect our children from these stories. When they're mature enough, they can listen.
Some of the stories are, I guess, damaging. On the other hand, I think in the case of me, I don't know. I think if I had a kid, I'd probably do the same, because, well, maybe it was peculiar to me, but maybe I needed to be plugged into the local kids. It was just another way, whether it was joining Cub Scouts or going to Sunday school. And I think I knew. I don't think my mother was secretive about it. I said, "Why don't you come to church on Sunday?" And she says, because she didn't believe in it. She's old enough to make that decision. So there's different ways to handle it. But there are some benefits to having a church in the community. Now, maybe you have to look between all of the flaws to see that.
I can think of one, because when I got married the first time, my mother-in-law chose the church on the basis of the size of the parking lot would be big enough to accommodate all the cars for all the guests.
Right. I mean,
and the denomination was of no consequence.
It's a function. And I argue that your daughter, who did have to go to some events at some of these churches, I mean, you can't help but pick up some of the dogma and just by being in proximity.
We actually had an argument one night, my daughter and I, on this very topic when she was about 28 or 29, and she was seemingly resentful that she hadn't gotten any of the Christian stories growing up.
Okay.
In fact, it was quite an argument we had. She thought I was wrong in not giving it to her.
Okay. I
think she has a different perspective today, nearly 10 years after that. So,
well, let me say something in support of your argument. So, we was talking about this the other day. In kindergarten, I think they sent a local policeman by to teach the little kids, and this is junior kindergarten, the dangers of not looking both ways and crosswalks and all that. And I remember they had and this would be the late 60s, they had incredibly, or very early 70s, incredibly low-quality cartoon of badly drawn, almost stick figure characters. But when they would get hit by the car or hurt, they would put X's in the eyes. And to this day, I still find myself traumatized by that, because it sent a clear message: it was death, and that even though it was depicted in such a palatable way, to a very young child. And so we come back to some of these stories, and if I really am honest about maybe not regular Sunday school, but when the teacher would be sick and there'd be a substitute Sunday school teacher, I think that sometimes people of different dogmatic degrees would inject their takes. Because a lot of the stories are brutal, they're vicious, they're unjust, sacrificing of sons and the hateful God. To a small child, it's devastating.
The greater offense to me is bringing up this word God and pretending that there's some value to this word, when out of every 100 people you'll get at least 50 different opinions of what God is, and realistically it's more like 100. Everybody's got their own different view. So what are you referring to when you're referring to God? And then you introduce this concept to children, and they buy into it rapidly, that there is a God. At some point they have to, if they wish to progress spiritually, they have to disabuse themselves of the concept of a God and stop using that word, except in OMG, and you're not going to stop that, right? The word God interferes with understanding. It does not help understanding. Apart from anything else, anybody who learns that word and believes there is one is then going to pursue evidence and the path of that imaginary God. And it's not all bad, but it's not good. Why follow a path that doesn't have real truth supporting it to reach a spiritual end? I think Christians can get there too. But introducing the idea of God to children seems to me a great offense. I don't care if that God's cruel or kind. Either way, doesn't matter to me. Don't use the word God. And
what about Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny? What you're doing is teaching a 5-year-old kid about lies and the artificial construct of what he's going to be going through in the next 30 years.
A large part of my work for the last 40 years has been using language to not just numbers, not just data, not just writing copy to change reality. And yes, indeed, you can change reality that way and say, this is a problem. There isn't anything you cannot find. You can find that you will not be able to come up with the opposite or the argument against it. So yes, sure, every thing, thought, concept can be assailed from every point on a sphere surrounding it, and you can interweave those arguments too. There's no truth, right? I've done interviews like for academic stuff that have lasted for 2 hours.
What were they about?
My relationship with religion was the most recent one. That was about 18 months ago.
Who was that with? Who?
A researcher at UBC. She'd run an ad in the Toronto Star asking about religion and whether anybody had left whatever faith they were brought up in and what their story might be. And she wanted to interview around that.
And in your case, you were brought up religious?
I was brought up in the Church of England, yes.
Wow. And what does that look like in terms of going to church every Sunday, Sunday school,
christenings, confirmation at the age of 12, cucumber sandwiches and cups of tea when you're inducted officially as a semi-adult into the faith of the Church of England. That's what it looks like. And it's prayers twice a day, like an assembly in the morning with prayers and a lesson read. Same thing in the evening, back in your boarding house. So we were dosed, and then divinity classes as well.
So you went to a religious private school?
It was a ordinary private school. However, it was it was a Christian-oriented private school.
So you were taken out of your home, essentially, and lived in a alien environment?
When you put it like that, it's perfect, because I felt like I was taken. I had no choice. I had to go. I was 9, and I was very, very unhappy about that.
So this is a bad comparison because your parents did it willingly, but there's a lot of talk about Indigenous Canadians in Canada. But in a way, they're taken away from their comfort, from their family, from love,
right.
And they're put in a strange building with strangers.
Yes, and I wouldn't compare my reality to theirs. It's so radically different. Theirs must have been terrifying. Mine was terrifying enough. Theirs is on a different level. They never see their families again. With me, I was going home every weekend.
Oh, every weekend.
Yeah. Yeah, until I got to be about 14 or 15 when I didn't want to go home anymore. So.
What does a religious upbringing do in terms of the guilt? I mean, as you become a teenager, you go through a time in your life where you're really drawn to all the sins, and people who are from religious upbringings actually deal with guilt.
I didn't see a connection between the religion and the dirty thoughts I was having at that age. None at all. They were in separate compartments. It wasn't like I felt there was a moral side of me that was condemning me for
Why
whatever
not?
it was.
Were you not a
What
believer?
do you mean, why not?
You were not entirely a believer, because I've heard a lot of talk about people who are literally racked with guilt as they reconcile.
Yeah, well, I imagined there was a God at the time, and I would have spelt it with a capital G. Now, today, I know that the idea of a God is ludicrous. I don't mean that. There's no such thing as a divine thought that's ludicrous, because divinity is all.
How long did you remain religious in terms of your upbringing?
I
When
carried
did
on,
you-
but when I was 24 and I came here, I filled out an application form for a job, and it has religion, and I put C of E down. That's the Church of England, and that's the last time I remember ever identified myself with the Church of England. Except, of course, there's this organic memory you have of all the things associated with it. So there's chapters, verses from the Bible that I can quote. There are stories from the Bible that I know that I wouldn't otherwise know. Because I know them, they can affect how I see things. I think if you've been a Christian, even a milquetoast Christian, like a Church of England Christian, then you need time to reduce the conditioning for it to affect you less and less. But to this day, I'll say Jesus, just like anybody else.
At what point in your adult life did you realize that you were going to keep pursuing Buddhism and meditation?
I don't know that I ever did think I would. I just started at the age of 18 or 19 in more real terms. I was reading books that I couldn't comprehend. It took me at least, I'd say 30 years before I had even the slightest inkling what Buddhism was about. And in fact, I wouldn't have got even to that point if I hadn't done deep Gestalt psychotherapy for 5 years. And by deep, I mean every week for 5 years. Weekends, week-long residentials. At the end of that, I was more available to this idea of spirit, quite independent of any notional God.
Sort of an intellectual route. Because analysis.
I actually think it's anti-intellectual.
Analysis or Buddhism?
Buddhism,
Okay.
in its path to the truth.
I'm not bringing this up because I want to do an ad for Buddhism and how it's going to solve all our problems. But you know what? Because we are in this era of too much information, and we're in an era where just for me to pretend to have a model of what's going on in U.S. politics, I need a set of charts with diagrams that point who's to who's to who to who. And that's all a smokescreen for what we really need to be concentrating on, which are all the other issues. So I was hoping that somehow you would have some insight on how to prioritize these issues, distance yourself from them, and make a safe space for mental health in the current news culture we're in. Is that asking too much from Buddhism?
It has nothing to do with Buddhism. I would suggest, however, the solution, if I were able to implement it myself, I'd be a hero in my own eyes, would be to say, just look at it and say, this too is an illusion. There's nothing here, folks. Move on. I don't think that in the end, ultimately, the Buddhism says anything more than that about everything. It's not said in a negative, bleak way, though. It's how it is.
That anything that happens at any point in human history is just a construct that we're all focusing on, but in the end, the trees will grow and the rocks will roll.
You know, when you get into history, you're at a different level, and I'd agree, but I'd say it applied to geography, too. That tree outside. I'd say it applied to mountains too. I think the whole thing is an illusion. But it's not a conspiracy. It's just the way it is. We're born into it. We buy into it. And this is what we look out and we imagine we see these things outside. And yet, realistically, we have no evidence they're outside of us.
I think what you just said is an incredible thing. It is an illusion, but it's not a conspiracy.
Yeah.
That's gold.
That's how it is.
Is that yours? Did you steal that?
No, I mean, in as much, yeah, but I mean, it's not like I don't read a lot, so you never know where anything comes from.
Why did you move to Thailand?
Because I went there 10 years ago, traveled through Thailand up to the north, and then across the Mekong into Laos, and then down the Mekong for 2 days on a boat to Vientiane, somewhere like that. Then down through Cambodia, and then came back up through Bangkok and came back home. On that journey, I'd met a teacher, a woman, who was looking for a volunteer teacher of English in a school nearby, out in the country as it happened. She lived in a small town, and there was this village, Ban Rai, which is the province, Sukhothai province. And so I ended up being a teacher there. That's why I went back in the first case. Then I came back here at the end of it when it didn't work out too well. I was there for about a year doing that. When I came back, my business started to boom, so I decided to keep on working until the money stopped flowing in. The money stopped flowing in about a year and a half ago, and I stopped working. So what was I going to do next? When I'm in Chiang Mai, say, and it's time to go out for a cup of coffee, and I walk along the street, it's like it's an adventure, even though I've walked along that street 100 times before. When I do the same thing on Queen Street West, I don't have the same feeling.
Wow. Do you ever, this is a little bit wacky, but I remember thinking this more even as a kid, just looking at the civil engineering of the city and knowing that my grandmother was essentially walking down the same roads, having a different experience, different historical context. And then you look at these cities that we live in North America, some of them are 150 years old easy, and people just live and die in them. And the cities stay the same. And it's the people that come and go. And there's an empty kind of hollowness in it. And I know from spending time up north in nature, I don't have that feeling up there. And it is the surroundings send different cues. Yeah, and I kind of hear what you're talking about walking down Queen Street, because it's the same stores. They're all
The only excitement is when one of them goes out of business again.
Wow.
But then you see, what I remind myself of is that I'm finding boredom in something that's only existing in my mind. So what have I done to cause my own boredom around that?
Let me ask you this. The people who've lived in that village their whole lives, isn't that like walking down Queen Street for them?
How can I ever know what it's like for them? To ask them that question is, from all I've know about Thais myself, which is not a lot, but from what I hear from people who know Thais far better than I, is that you'll never find yourself in a deep conversation with a Thai. Now, call that racial stereotyping if you will. In the meantime, I've never been in a deep conversation with a Thai. It's, how are you? Did you eat yet? And it goes on like this. And I find myself very comfortable with that. And that's the nature of the conversation, of the dialogue. I don't see it getting beyond that.
Is that because of the nature of the politics? Or is that something about the culture? Or
my guess is it's the nature of the Thais. Not all of them. There are intellectuals and artists and all kinds of other ones, but the ordinary, everyday Thais I meet across, just like I'm an everyday tourist there, they're all like that. They're all like that. They don't go deep. They're pleasant to talk to, though. They can talk about seemingly nothing. And in fact, with some Thais who have an interest in getting to know you better, sometimes they want to marry you because they know you're rich, and that'll make all their dreams come true. So even though they can't speak English very well, what they'll do is they'll speak to you, and you'll speak to them, and you will think they're understanding you, but they're accustomed to the art of saying, yes, no, I understand. Yes, oh, did that really? Stuff like that to you. So you believe that you've been understood.
But am I using the Buddhism? It's Buddhism.
It's a Theravadan Buddhist country.
Yeah, but okay, but as it applies to you, you corrected me at one point earlier. But it is Buddhism that could we put a label on what you're focusing on?
Not really, because what I do is learn from the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama as well as Yeshua ben Yusuf. These are the people who I learn from. But also whoever it was that actually wrote the Tao Te Ching. I find the first verse of the Tao Te Ching to be especially imbued with meaning. But there's many other passages in it that are. Not all of it is acceptable either to me, but still.
Okay. Why Thailand? Is Buddhism and meditation popular?
There are more Buddhist centers for the particular kind of meditation I do there.
Okay.
There's 9 in the country, all of which you can go to, spend 10 days there, not speak for 10 days. You don't eat after 11:30 in the morning. You wait until breakfast the next day, and you meditate about 10.5 hours a day while you're doing that. And a reminder, no speaking, no contact with others, no eye contact, certainly no physical contact.
What is the religious landscape amongst people who live in Thailand?
They're Theravadan Buddhists, which means Theravadan means the doctrine of the elders, and it's the original form of Buddhism, which differs from Mahayana. Let me say Mahayana first. There is the idea in Mahayana that those who become enlightened stay behind as long as they can and come back over repeated lifetimes, to come back until the entire human race or all sentient beings are raised to the state of enlightenment. Theravadins, on the other hand, say, look to yourself, find enlightenment for yourself. So there's a little joke amongst Mahayana who call the Theravadins not Theravadan but Hinayana, because their word, Mahayana, means the greater vehicle and Hinayana means the lesser vehicle. Now you can see why it's an actual difference in the philosophy. But of course it sounds to the ear like one is superior to the other. So, and as it happens, the particular teachings I tend to veer towards are the Theravadan or lesser vehicle philosophies.
So you're living in Thailand. I would consider you a news junkie.
Totally.
So here you are living in Thailand. Are you more or less connected to all of this crazy North American circus? Or
way less connected.
Okay.
Even if you're reading a lot of the media, which I do, what you get is it all in a vacuum because you're surrounded by some totally different reality. There is no North America around me. I'm in Thailand, so what is this? It's not like you don't know, but it's not as direct.
Maybe it makes it more palatable.
You also don't feel as threatened.
Right.
By it all going on, because, I mean, you're not the target for Russian missiles or Chinese missiles in Thailand. The Thai Air Force does drills, exercises with the Chinese Air Force. They're all buddy-buddy. So why Thailand? I don't know that there is a why. It's because it's where I became familiar with most quickly. I started learning the language there as well. Even when I was first there, not the first trip I took, but the next trip, the very next one, I spent 5 weeks at an intensive Thai class. And I come away from that being able to speak Thai. So there's a reason to not go to another country, because getting a grasp of the Thai language that I have now has taken a lot of effort. And it still doesn't come easy to me.
Well, how does the society differ on a day-to-day basis? I mean, how people relate to their government or their politics.
Politics is not discussed much. I've had a dozen in 10 years political discussions. I was in a cafe where I used to take breakfast some mornings, and the owner was there one day, about my age. He said something about the government. It's a military junta. There was nobody else around. I felt uncomfortable with him even talking about it, because I don't want to have a discussion like that. I don't want to be a party to it. I have no interest in it. I'm not there to make waves and understand things in that way. I'm there to be there. So occasionally in Chiang Mai, you'll see a military truck going by with like 14 soldiers on either side and the 2 rows of seats in the truck. But you don't see much of their presence. So how do they relate to it? They don't talk about it. Even among themselves, I know they don't talk about it much, but they do talk about it, but not much. It's not encouraged.
In North American life, we see the politics, not the issues of these politicians, and the minutia. And you know, every now and then when we have a crazy leader, we will talk about it at the dinner table. You know, about who's being paid off, or who's connected to who, or who said what, and who lied about this and that. That's probably not part of the Thailand fabric of politics, or is it?
There's a military junta that rules Thailand, admirals, generals, and so on. And at a soccer match last year, one of the generals was in one of the finest seats there. And when his team scored the winning goal, he raised his arms in the air, and because his sleeves were only a certain length, his arms, they came down a few inches. Press gets a shot gets blown up by the masses when it gets out in the newspaper, and you can see this watch he's wearing, which was something like a $70,000 US watch, and he's just a general in the army.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
So I want to get to Trump, because there's two ways to look at it. Is that you move to Thailand, it's not on your doorstep anymore, and maybe you don't follow it as much or in the same way as you used to, and then you back for a short period of time here in Canada, and you're reading your New York Times and all of your rags. Are you more engaged in it during your return back here, or
I'm far more engaged here. I read the same amount, but I have more conversations about it here. I've learned not to have them in Thailand. It's not worthwhile.
Yeah.
I'm lucky that some of the right-wing people I know are very rational and really decent human beings. Therefore, if I make the odd random statement about Donald Trump, they'll take it in good part. But then they come back with counters, and their counters can be quite interesting. I mean, I've taken a different view on Donald Trump recently, which goes along the lines of, yeah, he's awful. I mean, no question about it. It's just foul, the whole mess that surrounds him. On the other hand, I mean, he's got China's attention over the trade issue, and, you never know how. Well, maybe it'll end in nuclear war. I don't know. But on the other hand, he has done that. And he's got the same thing going with North Korea. Now, I think North Korea is, why would it be any other way, is trying to manipulate the situation and doing quite well at it. Did you see Kim Jong-un just recently said in the last 24 hours that America was taking some of the warmth out of the negotiations before they started?
I thought that. I was waiting for that because it looked like the North and the South bypassed Trump. And Trump wasn't getting any. Now, mind you, has that meeting that's supposed to happen in May. That should be any day.
Of course, South Korea can't afford to make any decisions without America. Because if they don't have his army, then the North can walk in. They're more militarized. South Korea doesn't have to be as developed militarily because it's got American support.
Isn't really the goal probably of North Korea to create some parts plants very close to the border with South Korea and get involved in the economy that South Korea has gotten rich?
Well, it would make rational sense. Not so much to do it at the border, but to distribute it through North Korea. Although the border would be a good place to start. So that their fledgling capitalist communist state could take off. Think about the sales, and then they'd be able to afford more closed-circuit TVs to track their citizens.
Well, I mean, the mythology of all of this is that the more capitalist a country gets, the more of a taste of Western civilization it gets, and therefore the more democratized it might become. But I don't know that that's panned out. That was the theory with China, is that by including them economically, we would soften their political ideology. I don't know that anyone's goal was that we were going to have elections in China, but I remember at least in the Clinton years, they were kind of trading off human rights issues against economic expansion, as they were trying to bargain with China. I don't know that it worked, but I think that's how they sold it to the American public.
Right, and when you say they, you mean the powers that be, and their
Right.
issue is that they get a president for 8 years, and they spend much of that time trying to tear him down. So what continuity does that president get? I mean, is there any continuity
No.
between George W. Bush and Obama?
No. And
Then again, is there any between Obama and Trump?
well,
Even
Trump
less
has
so.
said specifically he's there to undo every single thing Obama did, just
Yeah,
on
he
principle.
burned after that. You saw that White House press correspondence dinner where Obama reamed Trump publicly. This would have been when Obama was president, and it would have been
2 years ago, I guess.
no, it was more like 6 years ago, or 7 even.
Oh,
Probably 6.
So this is while Trump was questioning
Yeah.
his birthing.
It's what turned out later was going on in the background that night when Obama singled Trump out in the crowd and showed him on a huge screen his long-form birth certificate for the first time. And then he proceeded to skewer Donald Trump in a major way. It was quite thrilling to listen to because Trump was squirming.
I know what
He
you're
had
talking
to be.
about because I just today watched a YouTube of the White House Correspondents' Dinner, the portion of that had the comedian Michelle Wolf.
Oh,
So that I watched, but you know how YouTube feeds you the next video? Well, the next video was entitled something like "Hilarious Presentation by Obama at a White House and a Correspondents' Dinner." So I think that's what you're talking about. I didn't watch that other YouTube.
I wonder what impetus that gave Trump to run as president. He must have hated Obama that night. He was made a public spectacle of.
Well, he already had it in for him somehow because he's been playing the birther card and
Yeah,
every
all
other,
Obama was doing was fighting fire with fire and dishing back the same shit, but doing it publicly.
and using fact like the long form
Yeah.
document. Are we flirting with the destruction of democracy and fascism with this president?
I'd say there's a really simple answer to that question, which is, who knows? My bet is if democratic institutions in the US and the UK in particular, but also Europe, are stable enough, flexible, brittle sometimes, but overall serve well, then all probably will be good. I'm encouraged to see the United States putting its second fleet into the North Atlantic because of the situation with regard to Russia and China. What you may have read also was that about 3 months ago, Chinese and Russian warships went through the English Channel, which they have every right to do, of course. And that's the first time Chinese ships have ever gone that way. So it makes for an interesting situation, and the US is putting its fleet into the north as well, north of the Atlantic.
I think I read something about submarine activity in the Arctic, possibly on the Russian side, but still.
The Russians have been at that for years now. They're trying to get as much claim to the north as they can. The interesting thing about when you read about, and I'll switch the topic, but it's the same scenario, is with the digital stuff that Russia's doing to America and Britain. Why do we never read about what they're doing back to Russia? I mean, I don't care. It's all well and good with me. I just happen to imagine that they're beavering away, doing as much nasty, sneaky, underhanded stuff as they can do.
We invented interfering with elections. And we did that over the last 100 years in every country you can name. Right?
Whoever created the first election did that.
Yeah.
Athens, women weren't allowed to vote. Only people who owned land were able to vote.
Doug Ford is going to cut funding for the CBC and fire all the executives at Hydro One.
Good luck with firing the CBC. It's a federal crown corporation. It's nothing to do with him. So
And,
it just doesn't matter. It just shows his ignorance, doesn't it, really?
and they sold off part of Hydro One, so the provincial government is in the position to hire and fire at Hydro One, presumably. So it's another Trump.
And this would be firing a guy whose severance would be far more than he was being paid over a period of 5 or 6 years. So in fact, it'd be a waste of money.
Yeah.
But there's a better idea, which is to stop all this greenbelt nonsense around Toronto and build large concrete blocks on it.
Interesting sense of humor.
Well, what else is Rob Ford saying? Fuck the farmland, eh?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
I mean, I feel it is offensive when I go out and see yet another new development on old farmland. That's really good soil that's being built on, you know?
So he seems to have a lot of the characteristics that we admire in Donald Trump, like not being plugged into the truth, managing the moment by just saying whatever seems to work in the moment, never having a script, never clearing or vetting facts and information.
Yeah.
It's a lot
But
of
I'd
similarities.
compare him to a pendulum. We're his position on a pendulum. So if you can imagine a really big, strong pendulum swinging in that lazy, easy way that heavy pendulums have, and what you've got is a weight near the top. And so the top has got a lot of weight in its arc as it goes back.
That's an upside-down pendulum.
That pendulum is like this.
I see a pendulum like this, where the
Well,
weight swings on the bottom, but whatever.
Well, it's going to stay in the way orientation it is, but I take your point. Further down this thing, a long way down, is another little weight, but it's much smaller than that one. And it's also like 1.5 inches from the turning point. And that's Rob Ford, and that's Donald Trump, the big weight at the top.
Interesting.
I mean, who cares? You know, you could come in and ruin it, but what's any different to how Kathleen Wynne is spending money like there is no tomorrow? Promising balanced budget. Well, it ain't there yet. So how much bad can he do, Dave? I mean, I can't imagine how I look at those eyes.
Wow. We had Mike Miller with his Common Sense Revolution and his privatizing of, for example, water testing, which killed a bunch of people. So what could happen? What could he really do? He could take away some of these things that are in place for a reason, these things that we've given the responsibility to the government to oversee for good reason, because profit has no place in regulating certain utility-like things the government's in charge of. And you can over-privatize to the point where, what's next? Healthcare.
It wouldn't be anywhere near so easy for Doug Ford to be elected if Kathleen Wynne's government had not simply put all its social priorities in place and added to the amount of money that's being spent. Since I imagine government should run sensible debt to provincial domestic product, or whatever that is.
Okay. So it reminds me of just living in the city, and again, young in Eglinton, where in absolutely every single direction they're building something, whether it's a subway or a condo tower. If there's 360 degrees, there's 360 cranes. It's literally unbelievable. It's never been like that in my lifetime, ever once. Like, it's unbelievable. There's a huge amount of money being spent. Sometimes when governments pursue debt, they'll look at their province next door and they're spending, or they look at the country next door and it's expanding and spending in order to keep up with what's going on in other jurisdictions. Canada has to do the same and build. I mean, so on the building levels, with the buildings everywhere, some of this money that you're talking about being attributed to the debt is probably spending they've put off in the past, or that's required to keep Ontario up with its competitors, no?
Well, it seems to me, using a spending-based approach, or I suppose you're saying they see other buildings going up in Quebec and therefore they think they should have the same buildings here, whatever the...
Bad analogy, but
So
there's
keeping up with the
expansion.
Joneses. So
we have to plan for the next 100 years, the next 50 years. And it means building subways and building places for people to live, and the market
then
still
why
says
are
do
those
it.
plans so spavined and ridiculous? That Scarborough thing costing who knows how many billions of dollars now, before they even start building it. And it'll be double or more by the time it's finished. Why are they doing it? It's insane. It's just politics. It's crazy. And this is serious amounts of money, so why would anybody ever imagine this city would ever get its act together. When has it? When?
Well, I just can't believe, I can't say this enough. I lived a whole lifetime, and the rate of buildings being built was a certain pace. And in the last couple years, I have seen building the likes of which the world has never seen.
Yeah.
And it's like they're pre-selling the units. So it's not like if you build it, they will come. They're already sort of sold. I mean, have we not been keeping up with building in the past, or has something changed?
There's more population pressure here. Part of the market is shifting away from single-family homes towards condos as well. Not that the single-family dwelling market is doing badly. I mean, you know, it's like $960,000 average. And
I did read something just in the last couple of days saying that house sale activity has dropped to its lowest level.
About 12%
since
down in prices, apparently, since last year. But, I mean, for most people, it's meaningless.
Is that the prices or is that the sales?
Not the 12% referred to the prices. It's meaningless, right, for anybody who's living in a house they own, because what can I do? Sell it, then I got to buy somewhere else or go live somewhere else. So what then? Why would I sell? So price going down shouldn't trouble anybody at all, unless you're about to sell. And even then, it's not necessarily bad.
Somebody said, if you think living in Toronto is expensive now, just wait. I was thinking if they build too many condos, that's more future rental spaces that these owners of the condos will be renting them out. But it's going to be for $4,000 for a tiny apartment.
1975, I lived on a house on Bingham, which is 1.25 miles that way. Small side street. And 1.5-story house. There was room for a tenant upstairs. $47,000. My buddy Mike, I lived in it for a while. $47,000 he paid for it. And I hesitate to even think what that house would be today. But of course, one of the almost immutable laws of growth is that the more something grows, the less room it has to grow. At some point, it's going to stop. Either there's a bubble and the bubble gets pricked, or some structural thing changes in the market, like the mortgage stress tests and things like that.
Well, this propensity or ability to grow doesn't affect condos, because you don't have to travel very far from these condo clusters to find the old buildings that are capped at 3 and 5 stories and no condos to be seen for miles in any direction. So we're concentrating them all in these locations where there aren't schools and parking and infrastructure and stuff. But so when you look at the rest of the city, it's full of places they could build these giant condos. So this idea of encroaching on the green belt or running out of space for the city only works, I guess, if you're building houses, low density subdivisions. Then I guess that's where you have to crawl and creep.
Been in a few condos, and I find the sizes of them to be quite distressing when you look at how much they're selling for.
Let me ask you this. You ever go out on the balcony of an apartment on the 50th floor on a calm day? It's unbelievable. It's just like a Marx Brothers thing. Somebody hands you a bowl of potato chips and they all fly away. I mean, you can't tie everything down. It's like, and that's on a calm day. 50th story?
Really?
We're
That
not
sounds
even
exciting.
made. Yeah, well, it's a great view, but we're not. It's not functional. Okay, bad example. You couldn't leave an ashtray. You couldn't have an ashtray out on your balcony on the 50th
Because
floor.
it gets swept away.
You'd be blown in your face. It'd be like that scene from The Big Lebowski, where they throw the ashes into the wind and that all blows back in their face.
It's funny that I found The Big Lebowski a big bore.
It's a cult
I know.
comedy classic.
I never got it. Sometimes I don't
millions.
get stuff that everybody else does.
It's a little bit childish. Well, then what about that? Okay, comedy. It's supposed to be stupid half the time. It is.
Yeah, and
You have to be able to laugh
I've
at
never seen
stupidity.
the Blues Brothers either. I was never a Keystone Cops fan.
I think you're too old for those movies.
Well, whichever the equivalent was when I was growing up.
Wow.
I used to go and see comedies though sometimes, but I liked adventure movies when I was and horror movies. I was a big fan.
Is there some meaning to the court jester? other than being there just to entertain the king and the queen?
Absolutely.
Because we're back to that press dinner. They always have a comedian at the White House Correspondents' press dinner. Is that just, again, to lighten things up and make a dinner more entertaining? Or is there, and I mean this almost not spiritually, but in terms of just being an intelligent species, there's some connection between comedy and politics, rule of law, democracy?
The jester's role, one aspect of the jester's role, is to speak truth to power.
Okay.
By
Wow.
quoting it in comedy.
Huh. Is the only person who told the truth at that correspondence dinner the comedian?
Yeah. Well, truth is such a strong word, Dave.
Okay.
What do you imagine truth to be?
Only one thing. I get into this with the nuclear debate. Whenever you have two people of different opinions and then people start labeling things as fact and truth.
Oh, I agree in this area you can have truth and fact. But I think truth has a higher level meaning as well.
Higher than fact?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh my God.
Absolutely.
Can you explain that, or is that asking?
Well, why don't we say that fact is something that can be proven, possibly through physics, but not necessarily to be so, and the way it is? I would say the higher truth is one that you can only sense, that you can't describe.
Isn't that an impression?
Well, it's my temporary conclusion on my journey so far.
Okay. The court jester. Speaking truth to power. Did it work in monarchical, historical
Here, I'm willing to
context?
bet you this day there were times when the jester saved the life of the king because of his insight.
Really?
And I bet there are other occasions where with one flip of a wrist, he ordered one of his knights to cut the jester's head off. So I'd imagine that the bell curve being the bell curve, there would have been jesters who would have been rewarded with their 64,000 pieces of gold, and there would have been jesters who would have been rewarded with their heads cut off. And the whole mass would tend towards the center of the bell curve, and there'd be good jesters and bad jesters, and sometimes the good jesters would be treated badly and the bad jesters well. And this whole thing would be a big jumble, but the bell curve would pretty much dictate it.
If you had anthropologists, historians, journalists, and then comedians, I want to ask who's the one we should be listening to, but there's something about comedy, because you're interpreting, I'd say the present, but I guess you could there are jokes that make fun of the past as well, but it's a real-time interpretation of fact against an absurdity that brings deeper truth to the analysis of a subject or issue.
Sure, why not?
It's as important as a historian or any
Absolutely, without any reservations at all. The humor is what keeps it going.
So it's like in physics, there's sometimes in testing a theory, there's a test of symmetry. It's where you look to see if opposites illustrate any deeper meaning. And I wonder if that's the mechanical role of comedy, because it has you, as I said, juxtaposed situation against absurdity, which might reveal deeper truths.
Well, absolutely. Especially when comedy is allied with satire. The trouble is, when I think comedy, I tend to think of bathroom humor. I don't think of the more satirical kinds of humor, which we all love, of course.
Well, some of these comedians are very well read, highly intelligent, people who are very engaged in issues, and probably they're emotionally more affected by some of these issues than average Joe and Jane Sixpack, and yet they can make it funny. That, to me, is remarkable. You have to distance yourself from it in order to do that, I think. once you've figured out that it's important enough to focus on. The media is dying. Some say that without a strong and powerful media, you can't have a democracy.
Well,
What is the outcome of this perpetual change? I was going to say destruction of, but you know that these newspapers are shutting down, but there's more of an online presence. There's smaller outlets. There's something taking the void created by the death of the traditional news media.
Yeah.
And it's not going to be as good, but something is replacing it. If we're onto our crystal ball, where does it all lead?
I have no idea. Do you? I don't. I tend not to see it that way.
Isn't all the value in predicting where we're headed and therefore how to position ourselves?
Yeah, and I've been a student of probability theory since I was about 14, and what I have learned in that time is that there's nothing you can do to predict unpredictable events. So, fully accepted, not doable. One could ask, will there be a war between America and China or not? And the answer is, we don't know. Simple enough, huh? So
the people who looked like they could see the future and positioned themselves properly, those are just lucky anomalies.
Well, if you get an infinite number of prognosticators of the future predicting an infinite number of times, then sometimes they're going to be right?
Eventually the
you
monkeys,
just have to
eventually the monkeys will type a
pond
sonnet, no?
with leaves on it and jumping from frog to frog through the arguments. Bounce between this prophecy and that way and how it was said then. And there's a lot of lying goes on in areas like that. The prophecy thing.
Did our crumbling media manufacture Trump?
Well, he certainly gave him a lot of media exposure. Media exposure counts. But then you could say Mitt Romney had a lot of media exposure. What Trump, if they shut him down, cut him out, that would have been the wrong thing. The difference was what Trump did was when he was actually on air or being quoted, whatever, he was flamboyant and outrageous. Look at the way he put down those, 18 other contenders at the beginning of the presidential candidates with his, he said, low energy jab and his little hands Marco. Amazing. Guy's genius for put downs.
So I guess what I'm saying is that, had, for whatever reason, the media, as we understood it, done its job or not been scrambling for every ad it could cling to as it disintegrates, as the business model destroys it, would we have had the investigative journalists and the machinery of the media to keep in check the bizarre Trump? I understand they promoted it, but I think out of desperation because they knew they would sell more papers and it's very interesting, and I think the media's actually profited under this Trump era. I have to understand how we got here, and is it, some people say that the Democratic Party disenfranchised a large part of the people who make up the Trump base, and that's why he's here. And others would argue that the media was ineffective in combating this cult of personality.
Okay. Now, when was it the media's responsibility exactly to police the presidential system?
Do we not argue that you can't have a democracy without a strong and independent media?
Making it publicly aware, yeah, absolutely. Who says it's their job to do that?
That is their job.
Their job is to determine who is fit for office and who's not. Well, to a greater or lesser extent, I don't think Trump is.
Okay, so that's part of our mythology, because here in Canada, the first beginnings of our Canadian government, politics in early Canada focused around people who own printing presses. I mean, there's this very tight connection between a new democracy, responsible government, and the press in Canada. Not as clear on that connection in the United States, but in Canada it's part of the fabric of the first few weeks of our democracy here.
And in the end, it's going away, at least in the form that we knew it. I haven't read many newspapers in the last couple of years. I read one just a few days ago, and I found it strange, feeling that paper and stuff when I was reading it. It had become the strange form, whereas now the web was the ordinary way.
Would you ever have thought that you would live to a time where liberal-minded people were looking to the CIA and the FBI for a sense of returning them back to their true ideology? That's a bad way of wording it.
Yeah.
For guidance in ideology. The FBI and the CIA.
Would you ever believe that the president would be continually assaulting the FBI and the Department of Justice? Constantly undercutting his own administration's employees, the ones that he's appointed? Well, I think all a good and healthy thing, right? If the institutions survive. And if they're not strong enough to survive, then they weren't strong enough to survive.
Interesting.
Don't you think? It's like essentially Darwinian, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of like throwing spaghetti at the cupboard and seeing what sticks.
You know, give it 23 years and we might have 2 Chinese soldiers on guard outside this house because we're the bourgeoisie and we're about to be carted off to jail.
Well, you did kind of suggest that it was peaceful living in Thailand until Thailand is a military government. Maybe it would be more sane. I don't know. It feels like democracy is in a state of failure. I think the implications of all this are a lot deeper. If you thought people were uninspired by democracy before, I think this period is very dangerous. And as you say, we'll either illustrate the flaws in democracy and have us...
Okay, so Dave, what everybody was doing before all this democracy, I mean, democracies have a really fundamental principle, which is not to allow themselves to be wiped out by other forms of political organizations, other countries. Okay. So what you had was everybody except Britain and one other country in NATO not chipping in the 2% of their gross domestic product, or whatever the number is, for year after year, for decade after decade. While America picked up the freight, and people blamed Obama for saying, it's just not that important. But they were spending less for so long. And then you've got Putin behaving the way he does, and Xi, who had no apparent territorial ambitions. I find that worrying when I go to sleep at night.
That was Chris Hacker. Dave spoke to Chris in studio in Toronto. Find us on Twitter @thatarcher. Send us an email, archer@twxnet.com. For guest links and contact info, visit our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Find us on Android and Apple Podcast apps. Subscribe and rate the show on iTunes.
I'm Dave Archer.
And I'm Chris Hacker, visiting friends and relatives in Toronto.